Everyone celebrated. Critics celebrated. Audiences celebrated. The internet celebrated with a fervor that felt in February 2018 like something genuinely unprecedented. A superhero movie that made people cry not because of death or sacrifice, but because of recognition, because of pride. Because of what it meant to see African royalty and African technology and African beauty rendered on the biggest canvas Hollywood has to offer. Black Panther grossed $1.3 billion worldwide. It received 7 Academy Award nominations. It won 3 Oscars, including Best Original Score and Best Costume Design. It became, almost instantaneously, a cultural landmark. Not just a superhero movie, not just a Marvel movie, but a historical event, a statement, a mirror held up to a global Black audience and saying, "You exist, you matter, you are worthy of epic." I'm not here to take that away from anyone. But I am here to tell you that almost everyone who celebrated got the film exactly backwards. Black Panther is not a celebration of Black power. It is a tragedy about hoarded power. It is not a film about a worthy king earning his throne. It is a film about a king defending a system that should not survive scrutiny, and surviving scrutiny only because his opponent makes one catastrophic strategic error. It is not a film about T'Challa being right. It is a film about Killmonger being right and T'Challa winning anyway. And the fact that we celebrated that outcome says something deeply uncomfortable about what kind of liberation stories we are willing to accept from Hollywood. Here is the thesis, and I am stating it plainly because it deserves plainness. Killmonger is the film's moral center. T'Challa is its tragic flaw. And the ending, the outreach center, the UN speech, the magnanimous king opening his borders, is not a triumph. It is a confession. It is the film admitting, in the quietest possible voice, that Killmonger was right, while making absolutely sure he isn't alive to hear it. Let's start with what the consensus says, because the consensus is instructive about what we're willing to see. The consensus reading of Black Panther goes something like this. T'Challa is the worthy heir to the Wakandan throne, a man of honor and compassion who must defeat his cousin Eric Stevens, Eric Killmonger, a man scarred by abandonment and shaped by American violence into a weapon of rage. Killmonger represents the seductive danger of reactionary radicalism. His anger is understandable, but his methods are unacceptable. T'Challa's victory represents the triumph of thoughtful, principled leadership over vengeful, destructive ideology. The film ends on hope. Wakanda reaches out to the world, specifically to the Black diaspora, specifically to Oakland, specifically to the community that produced Killmonger, and suggests that the right kind of opening, the measured kind, the controlled kind, the kind decided by a king rather than demanded by the oppressed, is the correct path forward. That reading is so coherent, so tidy, so comfortable. It is also, if you watch the film with your critical faculties engaged rather than your emotional investment in representation, almost entirely wrong. Because here is what actually happens in Black Panther. Not what the marketing told you, not what the cultural moment needed it to be, but what the film itself, scene by scene, line by line, argument by argument, actually dramatizes. Killmonger is abandoned by his country as a child. His father is murdered by the king of that country. Murdered, not in battle, not in some morally ambiguous clash, but executed in an apartment in Oakland, California, because it was more convenient to silence him than to confront the moral implications of what he knew. That child grows up in poverty, in violence, in the belly of the American empire that Wakanda watched build itself over centuries from a safe, hidden distance. He becomes a weapon. Literally, he is trained by the most powerful military on earth to be a weapon. Because a weapon is the only thing a Black child in Oakland, abandoned by the wealthiest country on the African continent, could become if he wanted to survive. He then fights his way back to the country that abandoned him, challenges for the throne by the rules of that country's own traditions, and makes, in speech after speech, in confrontation after confrontation, the clearest, most historically grounded, most philosophically coherent argument for Wakandan intervention in global anti-Black oppression that the film offers. And then he dies. And T'Challa takes his arguments, strips out the urgency and the rage, rebrands them as enlightened generosity, and gets a standing ovation at the United Nations. You're supposed to feel good about that. The film needs you to feel good about that. The music swells, the lighting is warm, the children in Oakland look up at a Wakandan aircraft with wonder in their eyes. I want you to think very carefully about who those children's futures actually depend on in that final image. They depend on the benevolence of a king who spent most of the film defending his right to decide whether and how much of Wakanda's wealth and power to share with the global Black community. A king whose change of heart was precipitated not by the justice of the argument, an argument Nakia, his own partner, had been making for years, but by the traumatic spectacle of watching his murdered cousin choose death over subjugation. That's not a triumph. That's a parable about how long the powerful make the powerless wait, and how we're supposed to celebrate when the powerful finally move, even though they're only moving because they were nearly forced to. Now here's where it gets interesting. Here is what almost everyone misses. Black Panther is not a naive film. It is not an accidental film. Ryan Coogler is one of the most politically conscious filmmakers working in American cinema today. The director of Fruitvale Station, a film about the murder of Oscar Grant, does not stumble into arguments about state violence, Black abandonment, and the failure of institutions. Coogler knew what he was doing. The question isn't whether he intended the film's political complexity. The question is, what happened when that political complexity collided with the structural demands of a Marvel Studios tentpole that needed to gross $1 billion and leave its hero standing? What happened is that the film split in two. One half of Black Panther is a genuinely radical political text. It asks whether a nation that sat out the entirety of the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and contemporary anti-Black racism, while hoarding a resource that could have changed everything, has any moral standing whatsoever. It asks who gets to decide how liberation happens and on whose timeline. It asks whether the right way to fight oppression, the measured and diplomatic and legally sanctioned way, is actually a way at all, or whether it is a strategy for ensuring that nothing fundamental ever changes. This half of the film is, scene by scene, one of the most daring things a studio blockbuster has ever attempted. The other half of Black Panther is a Marvel movie. It needs its hero to win. It needs its villain to be defeatable. It needs its ending to be hopeful rather than honest. And it needs, above all, to not make its global audience feel implicated in the moral horror it has spent 2 hours describing. So it gives Killmonger a catastrophic flaw. Not in his argument, but in his method. It makes him want to conquer rather than liberate. It gives him the logic of empire. And then it kills him, tidily, with his own spear, and allows T'Challa to adopt his thesis in a form that has been surgically drained of its radicalism. What people miss, what the celebration obscured, is that making Killmonger's method wrong doesn't make his diagnosis wrong. And the film knows this. The film shows this. Every time T'Challa opens his mouth in the final act, he is speaking Killmonger's language. He has been converted. He just refuses to give credit to the man who converted him because that man is dead, and dead men can be safely eulogized without being heated. Here is what this essay is going to argue, in full, and I want you to hold every piece of it in your head as we proceed. First, Killmonger's arguments about Wakandan complicity, about the moral debt owed to the Black diaspora, about the violence of enforced passivity are not refuted by the film. They are adopted by the film. The evidence for this is in the film's own dialogue, its own staging, its own emotional logic. Second, T'Challa's victory is not moral but tactical. He wins because Killmonger makes a strategic mistake, choosing global conquest over targeted liberation, not because T'Challa makes a better argument. The film offers no sustained, credible rebuttal to Killmonger's core claim. It simply removes him. Third, the film's own sympathies betray it. The camera loves Killmonger. The score makes him compelling. The script gives him the best lines. These are not accidents. These are the seams showing where the radical film and the Marvel film are sewn together, and the stitching is loose. Fourth, the ending is not a resolution, it's a deferral. T'Challa builds an outreach center in Oakland, in Killmonger's childhood neighborhood. After spending the entire film fighting to prevent Killmonger from doing anything more significant than that, the film's ending is a monument to the gap between what its villain demanded and what its hero was willing to deliver. Fifth, and here's the stakes. Why any of this matters beyond the film itself, Black Panther arrived at a specific political moment when the debate between radical Black liberation politics and liberal incrementalism was more urgent and more contested than it had been in decades. The film dramatized that debate with startling clarity and then resolved it in the safest, most politically legible way available. What we celebrate when we celebrate Black Panther is, in part, our relief at being offered a version of Black liberation that doesn't ask too much of us. And that is worth being honest about. This isn't a Black Panther film. It isn't a T'Challa film. It is a Killmonger film. A film about a man who was right too early, too angrily, and in the wrong universe for his rightness to be rewarded. T'Challa is just the protagonist. Killmonger is the argument. Let me show you the evidence. You've seen this film. You probably saw it multiple times. You probably cried at certain moments and felt pride at others and walked out of the theater feeling like something important had happened. I'm not going to tell you that feeling was wrong. What I am going to tell you is that if you watch this film the way most people watched it, emotionally invested in T'Challa's triumph, prepared to celebrate Wakanda, primed by 2 years of cultural anticipation, you almost certainly miss the film's actual argument. It was hiding in plain sight in the scenes you probably fast-forwarded past on rewatches to get back to the battles and the costumes and the waterfall. Let me show you what you missed. The film begins, and this is not incidental, not in Wakanda. It begins in Oakland, California in 1992, a year after the Rodney King beating, a year before the Rampart scandal, the heart of the crack epidemic's second wave. A community being systematically dismantled by policies the United States government designed and then disclaimed. And 2 Wakandan men stand in an apartment above that city and argue about what Wakanda owes the people beneath them. N'Jobu, a Wakandan spy, T'Chaka's brother, has gone rogue. He has been living among the African diaspora. He has seen what they endure. He has decided, in the language of the film, to wake them up, to arm them, to give them vibranium-enhanced weapons, to force the confrontation that Wakanda's centuries of deliberate invisibility have prevented. T'Chaka confronts him. N'Jobu makes his case, I observed for as long as I could. Their leaders have been assassinated, communities flooded with drugs and weapons. They are overly policed and incarcerated. All over the planet, our people suffer because they don't have the tools to fight back. That's not radicalism. That's a history lesson. Every sentence N'Jobu speaks in that room is factually correct. The assassination of Black leaders, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., is documented history. The flooding of Black communities with drugs and weapons, the CIA's role in the crack epidemic, the Iran-Contra pipeline is documented history, or at least heavily evidenced. The over-policing and mass incarceration of Black communities is not a contested claim. It is the lived reality of millions of people standing outside the window of the apartment where this conversation is happening. Chaka doesn't argue with any of it. He never disputes a word of N'Jobu's diagnosis. He arrests him instead. And then, and this is the moment the film commits its first great act of moral clarity, When Zuri moves to betray Njobu's location and Njobu reaches for his weapon, T'Chaka doesn't subdue him. T'Chaka kills him with his hands in front of his son, and then T'Chaka leaves. He leaves Eric, 7 years old, his nephew, the child whose father he just murdered, alone in that apartment in Oakland in 1992, to be discovered by police and absorbed into the American foster system. Think about that. The king of Wakanda, the most advanced nation on earth, kills his own brother in front of that brother's child and then abandons that child to poverty in the most violent American city of the most violent American decade because bringing him back to Wakanda would be inconvenient, would raise uncomfortable questions, would force a conversation about Wakandan complicity in Black suffering that T'Chaka had no interest in having. This is the original sin. Not Killmonger's rage, not his violence, not his ambition. The original sin of Black Panther is Wakandan indifference, enacted by a king who is eulogized throughout the film as a great man, a wise man, a worthy father. T'Challa spends most of the film trying to honor that man's legacy. Killmonger spends most of the film being the consequence of that man's choice. The film knows exactly what it's doing in this opening scene. It is establishing with absolute clarity that Killmonger's grievance is not paranoia or trauma distorting reality. It is reality correctly perceived. The question the film raises and then spends 2 hours trying to suppress is simple. Given this origin, is T'Challa defending a system or a crime? Let's be precise here. The argument isn't that Killmonger is sympathetic, or that we understand where he comes from, or that his anger is justified even if his methods aren't. That's the safe, comfortable, actually I can see both sides reading that the consensus has settled on. The argument is more specific and more unsettling. Killmonger makes correct arguments that the film never refutes, not arguments that are emotionally resonant, not arguments that are understandable. Correct arguments. Arguments whose premises are factually grounded and whose conclusions follow from those premises with logical force. Scene 1. The Museum. The first time we see adult Killmonger, he is standing in a British museum looking at African artifacts. His companion, a woman we'll never see again, a relationship we're never given, asks a docent about a specific axe. The docent describes it confidently, incorrectly. Killmonger corrects her. The axe is from Benin, not Ghana, and the British got their hands on it the same way they got their hands on everything in this building, by taking it. He is right. The docent is wrong. The British Museum in 2018 held thousands of African artifacts acquired through colonialism, a fact that was and remains a source of active political controversy. Killmonger, in his very first scene as an adult character, is demonstrating a precise, historically grounded expertise that the people officially responsible for these objects do not possess. Then he poisons the docent and steals the axe. This is the film's sleight of hand. It shows you Killmonger being right about the theft, about the provenance, about the museum's complicity, and then immediately shows him doing something morally indefensible, as if the violence cancels the knowledge. But it doesn't. His method is wrong. His facts remain correct. The axe was stolen. The British Museum did acquire it through colonial violence. The docent was perpetuating a fiction. Killmonger walks into his very first scene, corrects the historical record, and is then positioned as the villain for caring about that record enough to act on it. Scene 2. The Throne Room. When Killmonger arrives in Wakanda and challenges T'Challa for the throne, there is a confrontation with the tribal elders before the combat begins. He is asked to identify himself. He does. He presents T'Chaka's ring, the evidence of his lineage, the proof that he belongs, the documentation that Wakanda itself required and that Wakanda itself provided for through his father's mission. And the Wakandan court is deeply uncomfortable. They are uncomfortable not because Killmonger's claim is illegitimate. It is entirely legitimate under their own laws, but because his legitimate claim forces them to confront what his existence means. He is the son of a man their king murdered. He is the child their nation abandoned. He is the living, breathing, walking consequence of Wakandan complicity, and he is standing in their throne room demanding the accounting they have spent 30 years refusing to provide. When Killmonger later takes the throne, when he wins the combat challenge, when he becomes king through the exact mechanism that Wakandan tradition provides for exactly this kind of succession, his first acts are appalling. The burning of the heart-shaped herb, the preparations for global war. These are genuinely destructive choices. But his throne room speech before those choices deserved to be heard, really heard, not filtered through the horror of what comes after. He says, "Y'all sitting up here comfortable, must feel good. There's about 2 billion people all over the world that looks like us, but their lives are a lot harder. Wakanda has the tools to liberate them all." That's not a villain speech. That's a Du Bois speech. That's a speech that belongs in a political philosophy seminar, not in the mouth of someone we're being prepared to watch die. And the Wakandan court's response to it is not to argue. It is to sit in silence, because there is no argument. He is correct. Wakanda has the tools. 2 billion people do look like them. Those people's lives are harder. The only thing the court can offer against this is precedent. We have never done it this way. We have always been hidden. Our tradition is secrecy, which is not a moral argument. It is an argument for the perpetuation of comfort. Scene 3. The Ancestral Plane Confrontation. After taking the throne, Killmonger has his own visit to the Ancestral Plane, the purple realm of ancestors that the film uses as a space for spiritual reckoning. T'Challa's visits there are opportunities for inspiration, for validation, for connection with the fathers and forefathers who shaped him. Killmonger's visit is something different and, I would argue, more honest. He finds himself in his Oakland apartment as a child with his father, and his father looks at him and sees in his adult son only what America made him. N'Jobu says, "They were going to kill me anyway. I'd rather die, so come on, I didn't raise you to be like this." The film does something devastating here. It shows us that even Killmonger's father, the man whose murder is the foundation of all his rage, whose cause he believes he is advancing, does not recognize his son's path as a continuation of his own. But look at what N'Jobu actually means. He means, I wanted liberation, not conquest. I wanted my people free, not my enemies subjugated. The tragedy is that Killmonger knows this. He says quietly, "Maybe your way didn't work." That line, "Maybe your way didn't work," that's the entire film. Jobu tried the legal-ish method, spy work, intelligence gathering, attempting to arm communities. He was murdered for it. His son watched that murder and concluded with brutal logical clarity that the measured approach was what got his father killed. So he became a different kind of weapon. He adopted the logic of empire because empire was the only thing that had ever successfully subjugated anything. He chose the conqueror's tools not out of bloodlust, but out of what he understood to be pragmatism. He is wrong about the method. He is devastatingly right about the premise. His father's way didn't work. Here is the part that the celebration consistently skips. Because to reckon with what T'Challa is actually defending throughout this film is to reckon with the possibility that the hero's cause is not heroic. What does T'Challa fight to preserve? Let's be specific. He fights to preserve a monarchy. A hereditary monarchy with no democratic mechanisms, no separation of powers, no representative institutions. A king is chosen by birth and affirmed through combat, which is to say, the most powerful person becomes king, which is less a system of governance and more an elaborate formalization of might makes right. He fights to preserve a tradition of secrecy and isolationism that, as the film openly acknowledges, has meant Wakanda watched the entirety of the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and 20th century anti-Black violence from a position of comfortable invisibility. This isn't a contested interpretation. T'Challa's own father, a man the film treats as a nearly infallible moral authority, implemented and enforced this policy. And the film gives us the result of that policy in its first 5 minutes. Oakland, 1992, a dead man and an abandoned child. He fights to preserve Wakanda's monopoly on vibranium, a resource whose withholding has, by the film's own logic, allowed the subjugation of billions of people to continue uncontested. The argument that sharing vibranium would be dangerous is never seriously made in the film. The argument that Wakanda alone should decide what happens with vibranium, that is the argument T'Challa makes, and it is an argument about ownership and sovereignty, not about safety. And in the film's most politically revealing moment, he fights a border battle. Wakandans with spears and vibranium-enhanced weapons fight against Killmonger's forces, which at this point also include Wakandans, which means Wakandans are literally killing Wakandans to decide whose vision of Wakanda prevails. T'Challa is joined in this fight by the CIA, represented by Everett Ross, who has spent the film trying to contain Wakandan technology within Western intelligence structures. The hero of Black Panther, in his climactic battle, is fighting alongside the CIA to defeat a black radical who wants to arm oppressed people. That is what is happening. That is the film's actual political content. And the music is triumphant, and the effects are spectacular, and Chadwick Boseman is magnificent, and so almost no one stopped to ask, wait, who are we rooting for here and why? The thesis doesn't rest only on Killmonger. It is confirmed quietly and persistently by nearly every other character who engages seriously with the film's political substance. Nakia, T'Challa's partner, has spent years in the field, in South Sudan, in Nigeria, in the places where the gap between Wakanda's power and the Black world's reality is most visible. She's been arguing long before Killmonger arrives for Wakandan engagement. She says it explicitly, "I believe there's more Wakanda can offer the world." She is not arguing for Killmonger's method, but she is arguing for his conclusion, that Wakandan isolationism is morally indefensible. And T'Challa, at the beginning of the film, is not particularly interested in her argument. He is interested in bringing her home. He is interested in the romance, not the politics. Nakia is the film's proof that Killmonger's thesis was available to Wakanda without the violence. She was making it. She was right, and she was being gently, affectionately ignored by the man who is supposed to be the film's moral exemplar. W'Kabi, T'Challa's best friend, the head of the border tribe, turns against him. This is treated by the film as a betrayal, a shocking act of disloyalty. But look at W'Kabi's stated reason. His father was killed by Ulysses Klaue, the arms dealer who stole vibranium from Wakanda. Klaue has been operating for years. Wakanda has never moved against him, never moved to bring him to justice, never used any of its considerable power to protect its people from someone who is actively pillaging and weaponizing its most precious resource. W'Kabi asked T'Challa to bring him Klaue. T'Challa failed. W'Kabi's grief and disillusionment are presented as misplaced, as manipulated by Killmonger's charisma, but his grievance is legitimate. Wakanda failed him. The film shows us this and asks us to treat it as a seduction story rather than a story about institutional failure. The UN speech, and then there is the ending. T'Challa stands before the United Nations and announces Wakanda's opening to the world. A delegate asks what Wakanda, a small nation, as far as the world knows, has to offer. T'Challa pauses, smiles, and the film ends. This is T'Challa's greatest scene. It is also an almost literal reproduction of Killmonger's argument, delivered to a different audience, at a different decibel, through a different institutional channel. Killmonger wanted to use vibranium to equalize global power. T'Challa announces he will use Wakanda's resources to address global inequality. The difference is in the mechanism and the urgency, not in the fundamental claim about Wakanda's obligation to the world. T'Challa got there. He just needed to watch his cousin die first. The evidence is not subtle. It is hiding in plain sight in every scene where a character who is not Killmonger articulates Killmonger's argument. In every scene where T'Challa defends a system the film has shown us is indefensible, and above all in that final image of an outreach center in Oakland, a building in a community funded by a king's charity offered as the resolution to a crisis that demanded revolution. You're probably thinking several things right now. You're probably thinking I've been selective, that I've emphasized the scenes that support this reading and glossed over the ones that complicate it. You're probably thinking that calling Killmonger right requires ignoring some fairly significant evidence to the contrary. You're probably thinking that this thesis, however rhetorically sharp, ultimately serves a provocateur's purpose more than an analytical one. I want to be fair to those objections. More than fair, I want to make them as strong as I can, because the thesis only earns its keep if it survives the best arguments against it. This is the most common objection, and it's the one the film most clearly endorses. Killmonger doesn't just want to liberate the Black diaspora. He wants to conquer. He wants to arm operatives in every country where Black people are oppressed and launch simultaneous uprisings that will establish Wakandan global supremacy. He is, the film tells us, adopting the logic of empire, using the colonizer's tools, the colonizer's strategy, the colonizer's definition of power to fight colonialism. This is not liberation. This is a different kind of domination. And so the objection goes, whatever the validity of his diagnosis, his prescription is poison, and that should settle the question of whether he's the film's real moral center. The counter-argument has genuine weight. Killmonger's plan would kill a lot of people. His vision of liberation is indistinguishable in its mechanics from imperial expansion. He would make Wakanda the dominant global power by force, which is precisely what he claims to oppose when Europe and America do it. But here is what this objection overlooks. Making the method wrong does not make the diagnosis wrong. A doctor can correctly identify a disease and prescribe the wrong treatment. The disease is still real. More importantly, this objection, that Killmonger's violence disqualifies his argument, is doing enormous rhetorical work that the film pretends it doesn't need to do. The film uses Killmonger's extremism as an escape hatch. It raises a genuinely radical question. Does Wakanda owe its power to the Black world? And then constructs its villain in such a way that saying yes to that question seems to require agreeing with genocide. This is a rhetorical trap, not a genuine rebuttal. The question of whether Wakanda owes the diaspora its resources and engagement is entirely independent of the question of whether Killmonger's specific method of enforcing that obligation is correct. These are separate questions. The film conflates them. The consensus conflates them. And in that conflation, a real argument gets buried. Moreover, and this is the point that should make us most uncomfortable, Killmonger's adoption of imperial logic is not a character flaw separate from his politics. It is a consequence of his politics, or rather of the circumstances that produced his politics. He was trained by the United States military. He was given the tools of empire because those were the tools available to him. Wakanda, the country that could have given him different tools, chose not to because Wakanda's investment in its own security required abandoning him. His violence is not incidental to the film's argument. It is the argument. This is what happens when you leave someone in Oakland in 1992 and expect them to find a non-violent path to liberation. The method critique doesn't defeat the thesis, it confirms it. This is the most structurally compelling counterargument. You could argue that the film's arc is precisely about T'Challa's evolution, that he begins as a man committed to tradition and ends as a man committed to justice, and that this evolution, precipitated by his encounter with Killmonger's challenge, is the film's moral progress. He does, after all, open Wakanda. He does go to the UN. He does go to the outreach center in Oakland. He does, in the film's final image, offer Wakandan technology to a child in the community that produced his cousin. The king changes. Isn't that the point? Here's what this reading misses. The question isn't whether T'Challa changes. He clearly does. The question is whether the change he makes is commensurate with the problem he has spent 2 hours allowing to continue. Killmonger's argument was urgent. Millions, billions by his count, of people are suffering now, have been suffering for centuries, while Wakanda has the resources to address that suffering. The response to urgency is not a managed, controlled, paternalistic opening of borders at the discretion of a king who had to watch his cousin die before he could be moved to act. The response to urgency is urgency. What T'Challa offers is incrementalism, enlightened, benevolent, king-approved incrementalism. This is the liberal fantasy of change. The powerful, moved by the suffering of the powerless, choose, at their own pace, to share some portion of their power in ways they control, at times they determine. The powerless are expected to be grateful. The powerful are expected to be celebrated. And the question of whether the powerful had any right to their hoarding in the first place, that question disappears because they're being generous now, and generosity retroactively launders injustice. The Outreach Center in Oakland, which is Killmonger's neighborhood, which is where T'Chaka left his nephew to die, which is the specific geography of Wakanda's greatest moral failure, is not a resolution. It is a monument to how much T'Challa is willing to do compared to how much was demanded. It is a building. It is funded by Wakandan charity rather than Wakandan justice. It helps the people of one neighborhood, in one American city, in one country, in a world of 2 billion people that Killmonger correctly identified as waiting. T'Challa came around, just not far enough, and the film wants us to celebrate him anyway. This is actually the most philosophically interesting counter-argument, and it's one that Frantz Fanon himself grappled with: the danger that anti-colonial violence reproduces the structure of colonial domination rather than dismantling it. Killmonger doesn't want to free people. He wants Wakanda on top. His liberation is Wakandan supremacy. And supremacy, regardless of who holds it, is not liberation. This argument has real teeth. Killmonger explicitly tells Wakandan elders that he plans to burn it all. He is not interested in coexistence, in shared power, in dismantling the structure of global dominance. He wants to be the dominant power. He is, in this reading, not a Fanonian revolutionary, but a mirror image of the colonizer. He has so thoroughly internalized the logic of power as dominance that his vision of freedom looks indistinguishable from empire. The problem with using this critique to defeat the thesis is that it proves too much. If Killmonger's adoption of imperial logic disqualifies his argument, then we have to ask who gave him that logic, who trained him, who created the conditions in which a man wanting to help his people could only conceptualize help through the frameworks of conquest and dominance. The answer is, the American empire did, and Wakanda, by refusing to provide an alternative, by refusing to bring him home, give him different tools, show him a different way to conceptualize power, is complicit in the formation of the thing it then destroys. The film actually dramatizes this in Killmonger's ancestral plane scene, which I discussed in Module 2. His father says, "I didn't raise you to be like this," but his father didn't raise him at all. Wakanda didn't raise him. America did. The thing that is disgusting about Killmonger's imperial logic is precisely that it is not original to him. He learned it from the system that abandoned him. To critique him for that learning is to critique the symptom while ignoring the disease. Moreover, the critique of Killmonger's imperialism is most devastating not as an argument against his character, but as an argument that confirms the thesis. If the only language of liberation available to a black man abandoned by Wakanda is the language of empire, then the film is saying something genuinely radical about what colonialism does to its survivors. It doesn't just take things. It takes the imagination of alternatives. It leaves you with only the conqueror's toolkit, because the conqueror is the only one who ever showed you that the toolkit exists. That is a devastating indictment, not of Killmonger's character, of the world that made him. Some critics, and this is a reading that has genuine critical sophistication, argue that the T'Challa-Killmonger conflict is primarily a meditation on the difference between African identity and African American identity. T'Challa is Wakandan. His identity is rooted in place, tradition, lineage, cultural continuity. Killmonger is American. His identity is forged in displacement, violence, rupture, and survival. The film is about what these two identities owe each other, not about who has the better political program. This reading has the virtue of being more culturally nuanced than the who wins the debate framing. It acknowledges that both T'Challa and Killmonger represent something real, something lived, something that goes beyond policy disagreement into existential difference. And it explains why the film can feel, to different Black audiences, like very different films, African viewers seeing T'Challa as a familiar archetype of traditional governance, African American viewers seeing Killmonger as the mirror of their own relationship to ancestral homeland. But here's what this reading cannot escape. The film doesn't let its conflict stay at the level of identity. It politicizes it. Killmonger doesn't just represent African American displacement, he represents it through a specific argument about Wakandan complicity, vibranium as political resource, and the moral obligation of the powerful to the oppressed. The film refuses to keep this at the level of cultural meditation. It drags it into the arena of political argument through Killmonger's speeches, through the elders' debates, through T'Challa's UN speech. Once those arguments are made, they have to be answered. Cultural difference is not an answer to a political argument. You have a different cultural identity is not a rebuttal to 2 billion people are suffering and you have the tools to help. The identity, not politics. Reading is the reading that keeps the film comfortable. It is the reading that lets you feel the emotional resonance of both characters without having to decide who's right. But the film doesn't let you stay there. It forces the political question, and then it resolves it in the most politically conservative way available. That resolution is worth examining. This is the meta-argument, not about the film's content, but about the appropriateness of applying this kind of analysis to a film that was made by a Black filmmaker for a global Black audience as an act of representation and celebration. To read Black Panther as a film that accidentally makes the villain's case is, in this view, to impose a political framework that was never the film's purpose, to find failure where there was only joy, to be that guy, the critical party pooper who can't just let something be beautiful without interrogating it into sadness. I want to be honest about why this objection doesn't work. It confuses the filmmaker's intent with the film's argument. Ryan Coogler is a magnificent filmmaker and a politically serious human being. These are not in question. The fact that he intended Black Panther as a celebration does not mean the film functions only as a celebration. Films are not transparent transmissions of intent. They are complex texts that can argue against their creator's intentions, can be pulled in directions by the structural demands of genre and studio, can be more honest than their makers planned. The greatest films are often most honest precisely where they are least controlled. Black Panther is a film that argues something more complicated than its director necessarily intended, because the material it chose to dramatize, the real history of African complicity and non-complicity in the slave trade, the real history of Pan-Africanism, the real political landscape of 2018, is more complicated than a celebration can fully contain. The film's complexity is not a failure. It is its greatest achievement. Acknowledging that complexity, arguing about it, letting Killmonger's voice ring as clearly as the film itself allows it to ring. That is not taking something away from Ryan Coogler. It is engaging seriously with what he built. 2018 looked like, felt like, smelled like in the political air. The NFL protests were entering their second year. Colin Kaepernick had been effectively blacklisted from professional football for the act of kneeling during the national anthem, a gesture so modest, so non-confrontational, that its suppression itself became the argument. The debate wasn't about the gesture anymore. It was about whether Black Americans had the right to register dissent at all, and through what channels and at whose convenience. The President of the United States had called protesting athletes sons of bitches from a campaign rally stage. A portion of the American public agreed. Ta-Nehisi Coates had published Between the World and Me in 2015, and the book was still circulating, still being assigned, still being debated in the spaces where these things get debated. His essay, The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic, published in 2014, had reignited a conversation about material redress for slavery and its aftermath that the American mainstream had spent decades burying under the language of moving forward. The reparations debate was the Killmonger debate, conducted in prose. Do the powerful owe the dispossessed a material accounting, or is the most they can offer some version of charitable goodwill? Black Lives Matter had been a named movement for 4 years. The Ferguson Uprising was 4 years in the past. The Movement for Black Lives Policy Platform, a comprehensive, radical document that went far beyond police reform into structural, economic, and political transformation, had been published in 2016. The mainstream had largely responded to it by focusing on the least radical element, police accountability, and retreating from the more demanding claims about reparations, political self-determination, and economic restructuring. The debate between radical liberation politics and liberal incrementalism, between defund abolish and reform improve, was not a future debate. It was the present one. And in South Africa, the post-Mandela promise was curdling. The African National Congress, the Party of Liberation, had become a vehicle for elite capture. The question of land, who owned the land colonialism had stolen, whether redistribution was coming, what that redistribution would look like, was becoming urgent, volatile, politically combustible. Across the continent, the gap between the rhetoric of African independence and the reality of neo-colonial economic structures was producing a generation of young Africans who had absorbed the language of Pan-Africanism and were finding it insufficiently radical for what they faced. Into this moment walked Black Panther, carrying the weight of all of it, whether it wanted to or not. The film didn't arrive into a vacuum. It arrived into a live argument about the most fundamental questions of political philosophy as they apply to Black life globally. Who owes whom what? Who decides? How urgent is the debt? What methods of collection are permissible? Is gradual, elite-controlled change an acceptable answer to centuries of systematic plunder? Or is it another form of the plunder, the powerful keeping control of the timeline and the mechanism of their own accountability? Killmonger is not an invented character. He is a synthesis, a composite figure assembled from the full tradition of Black radical thought, a man who carries Du Bois's insight, Fanon's analysis, Malcolm X's impatience, and the specific American experience of colonized consciousness turned inward and then outward again. He is also, and this is the detail the film includes, with almost reckless honesty, a product of the American military-industrial complex trained by the CIA and Special Forces to do violence in service of empire before turning those skills toward a different purpose. He is, quite literally, a weapon the American empire built and then lost control of. That is not a metaphor. That is the film's explicit backstory. And T'Challa is not an invented character either. He is a synthesis of a different tradition, the tradition of elite Pan-Africanism, of managed independence, of enlightened governance by educated elites who believe that the best hope for Black liberation is the cultivation of legitimate, globally recognized institutions and the careful, strategic exercise of power within existing international frameworks. This tradition has its own heroic figures. Kwame Nkrumah in certain moods, Nelson Mandela in his most celebrated form, Barack Obama as understood by his most devoted supporters. It is a tradition that takes seriously the reality of power and the danger of uncontrolled change. It is not a cowardly tradition, but it is a tradition with a specific failure mode. It is a tradition that consistently asks the most urgent and most suffering to wait, because waiting is the condition of operating within legitimate frameworks, and legitimate frameworks move slowly, and slowness is a form of violence against people for whom the crisis is now. The film encodes this failure mode in T'Challa. He is not a bad man. He is a man for whom the system mostly works, because the system was built to work for kings, and he is a king. His evolution over the course of the film is genuine, but his evolution requires the death of a man who was abandoned, the burning of the heart-shaped herb, the near destruction of Wakanda. All of it avoidable if T'Challa had listened to Nakia earlier, had reckoned with his father's crime earlier, had asked the question Killmonger forces him to ask before Killmonger forced him to ask it. The political philosophy encoded in this film is not subtle once you look for it. It is the eternal argument between the radical and the reformist, dressed in vibranium armor and Afrofuturist aesthetics and a soundtrack by Kendrick Lamar. And the film resolves it the way liberal institutions always resolve it, by adopting just enough of the radical's argument to diffuse the radical's urgency, while ensuring the radical himself does not survive to see his argument vindicated. You cannot talk about Black Panther seriously without talking about Frantz Fanon, even if you've never heard of him, because the film is in conversation with his ideas whether it knows it or not. Fanon was a Martinique-born psychiatrist who became one of the most important theorists of anti-colonial revolution in the 20th century. His two major works, Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth, provide the philosophical framework within which Killmonger becomes legible, not as a villain, but as a theoretically coherent political actor. The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961 with a preface by Jean-Paul Sartre, argues that colonial violence is not incidental to colonialism. It is constitutive of it. Colonialism is violence. The relationship between colonizer and colonized is fundamentally a relationship of violence. Violence that structures every social, economic, and psychological dimension of colonized life. Given this, Fanon argues, the only adequate response to colonial violence is counter-violence. Not because violence is inherently good, but because the violence of colonial subjugation can only be broken by a force sufficient to rupture it. Reform, working within the system, gradual change. These strategies leave the fundamental structure of colonial violence intact. They adjust the conditions of subjugation without ending subjugation itself. Killmonger is a Fanonian character. Not because Coogler necessarily set out to write a Fanonian character, but because a character who looks clearly at Black global oppression and concludes that charity and incrementalism are inadequate responses will inevitably arrive at something like Fanon's position. The logic forces you there. But Black Panther is also a critique of Fanon, specifically of the failure mode Fanon himself identified but couldn't fully resolve, the danger that the anti-colonial revolution, in adopting the methods and frameworks of colonial power, reproduces colonial structures under new management. Killmonger doesn't want to dismantle the global structure of dominance. He wants Wakanda on top. He has internalized the idea that the only alternative to subjugation is supremacy, which is the colonizer's idea, imposed on the colonized through centuries of demonstrated power. In this, he is a Fanonian revolutionary who has been captured by the logic Fanon warned against. This is the film's most sophisticated move, and it is the move most people miss because it requires holding two things simultaneously. Killmonger is right about the diagnosis, and Killmonger has been deformed by the disease he's diagnosed. These are not contradictory claims. They are, in fact, the film's most honest reckoning with the real tragedy of colonial violence, that it does not just take things from people, it takes the capacity to imagine liberation in non-imperial terms. Killmonger can see the injustice clearly. He cannot see past it to a vision of justice that doesn't reproduce the injustice in a different form. And here is the question that the film raises and then refuses to fully answer. Whose fault is that? Is it Killmonger's failure of imagination, or is it Wakanda's failure to provide the conditions in which a different imagination was possible? W.E.B. Du Bois gave us the concept of double consciousness, the experience of being Black in America, always seeing yourself through the eyes of the white world that defines you as problem, as threat, as other, always having your self-perception mediated by someone else's contempt. Always living the psychological violence of having to justify your existence to a system that was built to deny it. Killmonger has inverted double consciousness. He sees himself not through the eyes of whiteness. He has burned that mediating lens through military service, through violence, through the deliberate construction of himself as weapon. He sees himself through the eyes of the world that abandoned him, Wakanda. His rage is not directed at white supremacy as an abstraction. It is directed at Wakanda's complicity in white supremacy's survival, at the specific choice a specific king made in a specific apartment in 1992, at the system that produced the condition where the most powerful Black nation on earth could choose comfort over justice and have that choice called tradition. This inversion makes him uniquely unnerving. He does not want to be recognized by the white world. He does not want integration. He does not want a seat at any existing table. He wants to overturn the table, not metaphorically, but structurally, globally, with weapons. His vision is post-double consciousness. He has moved past the need for the oppressor's recognition entirely into a space where the only relevant question is power, and power alone. T'Challa, by contrast, ends the film by going to the United Nations and asking for recognition. He stands before the assembled nations of the world, most of which have participated in the oppression of the people he claims to represent, and announces Wakanda's presence. He is seeking legitimacy from the institution of international order. He is, in Du Boisian terms, presenting himself and his nation for recognition by the world that previously denied their existence. This is not wrong. This is not cowardly. But it is, in the film's own terms, the more conservative gesture. It asks the global order to include Wakanda, rather than challenging whether the global order's legitimacy is worth appealing to. There is one more piece of context that matters here, and it is the most personal. Black Panther was released in February 2018 and became almost immediately more than a film. It became an event, a statement, a cultural intervention. People dressed in traditional African garb to see it. Schools organized group trips. The film's success was experienced by much of its Black audience as a vindication, proof that Black-led films with Black casts could succeed on the largest possible stage, that Hollywood's claims of unmarketability were lies, that Black joy and Black excellence could be spectacle on the same terms as any white superhero story. This context matters because it changed the conditions under which the film could be read. To critique Black Panther in February 2018 was not simply to critique a film. It was to risk being heard as critiquing Black representation, Black joy, Black cultural achievement. The film's cultural weight made rigorous analysis feel like a betrayal. Who wants to be the person asking hard questions at a celebration? But celebrations are exactly the moments when hard questions are most necessary, not to ruin them, to understand what is actually being celebrated. What Black Panther offered was representation without radicalism, or, more precisely, radicalism that was perfectly calibrated to be legible to radical sensibilities while remaining palatable to the mainstream. It gave audiences Killmonger's arguments in Killmonger's voice, and then killed Killmonger, allowing the arguments to survive in a sanitized form. It gave audiences the aesthetics of liberation, the costumes, the music, the technology, the Afrofuturist visual language, without the politics of liberation. It allowed its audience to feel the thrill of radical possibility without having to decide whether they actually endorse it. That is a significant achievement. It is also a significant limitation. And the gap between the achievement and the limitation is precisely the gap between what the film is and what it was celebrated as being. The celebration was real. The film earned it. But the celebration also obscured the film's honest, complicated, painful argument. And in obscuring that argument, we lost the opportunity to have the conversation the film was, almost despite itself, trying to start. There is a history that Black Panther is in dialogue with, even if it doesn't announce itself as such, the history of Pan-Africanism, the political movement that argued for the unity and solidarity of African and African-descended peoples across the globe as the basis for liberation from European colonialism and its aftermath. The Pan-Africanist movement's greatest hope was that independent African nations, Ghana under Nkrumah, Tanzania under Nyerere, Guinea under Sekou Touré, would become the base for a continental and then global project of Black liberation. That hope was systematically destroyed. Some of its leaders were overthrown in CIA-backed coups. Some succumbed to the authoritarianism that power tends to produce. Some found that the pressures of neo-colonial economic structures made genuine independence impossible regardless of political will. By the 1970s, the dream of a unified, powerful, liberation-focused Pan-African movement had been deferred. Wakanda, in the context of this history, is a fantasy of the Pan-African dream fulfilled. An African nation that was never colonized, never subjugated, never forced into the neo-colonial economic structures that ground actual African states' potential to nothing. It has everything the Pan-African movement needed and never got: material power, political independence, technological advancement, cultural continuity. It is explicitly what might have been, and it chose not to use any of it. That is the film's core provocation, even if it doesn't fully confront the implications. Wakanda is the Pan-African dream fulfilled, sitting idle, while the actual Pan-African dream was murdered in the streets of Accra and Kinshasa and Algiers. The film's fantasy is seductive precisely because it allows Black audiences to imagine the power that was taken, and then asks, very quietly, very uncomfortably, what would that power have actually done? Would it have fought? Would it have shared? Or would it have protected itself, like every other powerful nation in human history, by deciding that its security was more important than the suffering it could see, but chose not to engage? Killmonger's answer is, it would have fought and should fight now, and the only reason it hasn't is the cowardice of its kings. T'Challa's answer is, it will open now, carefully, on its own terms, with appropriate safeguards. History, the actual history of what powerful nations do when confronted with the suffering of the powerless, does not support T'Challa's optimism. But it also does not support Killmonger's faith that violence produces liberation rather than reproducing oppression. History supports the tragedy of this film, not its resolution. Both men are, in different ways, wrong about the mechanism, but only one of them is wrong about the disease. Here is the thing about Ryan Coogler as a filmmaker: he cannot lie, not completely. He is too honest a craftsman, too serious an artist, too deeply invested in emotional truth to construct a film that is purely ideological scaffolding. Black Panther is, at the level of filmmaking, cinematography, editing, performance direction, score, production design, an argument that runs parallel to and frequently contradicts the film's official narrative. The craft tells the truth that the plot can't afford to say out loud. Let me show you what I mean. Watch how Black Panther shoots T'Challa in his kingly capacity versus how it shoots Killmonger in his. T'Challa's throne room scenes are shot with deliberate formality, wide shots establishing hierarchy, the ritual geography of Wakandan power visible in the frame. When T'Challa is functioning as king, performing the ceremonial role, the camera treats him with the visual language of institutional legitimacy. The shots are composed, considered, beautiful, in the way that official portraiture is beautiful. They document power rather than interrogate it. Killmonger's scenes are shot differently. When he enters the museum in his first adult appearance, the camera is close, personal, interested. The editing rhythm changes. There's a sharpness to his scenes, a quality of attention that is distinct from the film's more ceremonial visual register. The camera doesn't position Killmonger as an institution. It positions him as an individual, someone whose inner life is legible, whose physicality communicates thought, whose presence in the frame is always slightly destabilizing to the compositions around him. Michael B. Jordan's performance is part of this, obviously, but Coogler shoots that performance in a way that invites interpretation rather than judgment. When Killmonger makes his arguments in the throne room, the camera finds his face, not his position in the power hierarchy, his face, his eyes. The way he delivers the line about 2 billion people suffering is shot as a close-up, and what that close-up does is make it impossible to receive his argument as abstraction. You see the argument as a person, a specific person. A person with history and loss and clarity. Compare that to the way the film shoots T'Chaka in the opening scene, the scene where he murders his brother and abandons his nephew. T'Chaka is shot with regal distance. The camera is not close to him. We don't get the intimacy of understanding his choice, we get the frame of his authority. He is doing what kings do, and the visual language treats it as such. It takes enormous deliberateness to shoot the villain origin of your film's actual villain, Killmonger, with more humanity than the institutional figure who committed the crime that made him. This is not an accident. Coogler is making an argument with the camera that the script cannot fully endorse. The man you're supposed to hate is the most human person in this film. The score of Black Panther is a genuine achievement. Ludwig Göransson traveled to Africa, worked with Senegalese musicians, built a sonic world that was new and specific and deeply considered. It won the Oscar for Best Original Score, and the award was deserved. But listen, really listen to what the score does around Killmonger. Killmonger's theme is not the villain theme. It doesn't employ the traditional musical markers of menace, low brass, dissonant harmonics, the visual music grammar that tells you to feel afraid. Killmonger's theme is aching. It has the quality of grief made sonic. It is, underneath its rhythmic drive, a lament. When Killmonger is on screen, particularly in his more vulnerable moments, the ancestral plane, the death scene, the score stops performing threat and starts performing loss. This is a compositional choice with clear emotional implications. The music is telling you, at a level below conscious thought, to feel something other than relief that this man is dying. It is telling you to mourn, and it earns that instruction. The death scene. Bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who jumped from the ships rather than live in bondage, is scored in a way that would not be out of place at a hero's death. The melody is sorrowful in the way that genuine tragedy is sorrowful, not because something bad has happened, but because something necessary and right and irretrievable has been lost. The Kendrick Lamar soundtrack is doing related work at a parallel level. All the Stars, which anchors the film's closing movement, is not a triumphant victory anthem in any conventional sense. It is ambivalent. Its imagery is cosmic, its emotional register suspended between hope and elegy. Pray for my father, pray for my mother. That's not celebration. That's the child in Oakland, grown up, still carrying the loss. Lamar curated the film's soundtrack as a Black Panther album. Black Panther, the album, released simultaneously with the film, and the most politically charged track on that album, King's Dead, featuring J-Rock, Kendrick, and Future, is not about T'Challa. It is about the corruption of power, the failure of kings, the distance between institutional authority and moral authority. The album is, in aggregate, more sympathetic to Killmonger's reading of Wakandan failure than to T'Challa's defense of it. The film imported Kendrick Lamar as a collaborator and got, along with extraordinary music, a political consciousness that refused to fully subordinate itself to the film's official conclusion. The production design of Wakanda is magnificent. The work of Hannah Beachler, who won the Oscar for it, constructed a visual language of Afrofuturism that drew on actual African architectural traditions, the cliff dwellings of the Dogon people of Mali, the color and geometric patterns of various West and Southern African textile traditions, the scale and ceremony of actual African royal courts, and synthesize them into something both specific and fantastical. But production design is never just aesthetic, it is argument. Look at where Wakanda's grandeur is concentrated. The palace, the throne room, the ritual waterfall, the vibranium mines, which are beautiful in the film's visual register despite being mines, despite being structurally the thing that makes Wakanda's grandeur possible, the extraction that funds the opulence above. The city of Wakanda is the city of Wakandan elites. When do we see ordinary Wakandans outside of the ritual and ceremonial spaces? We see them as spectators at combat, as soldiers, as members of institutions. The film's visual world, for all its beauty, is the visual world of a monarchy, oriented upward toward the king, toward the palace, toward the throne. Contrast this with Oakland. Contrast this with Oakland. The film returns to Oakland twice, once in 1992 in the origin scene and once at the end in the Outreach Center. Oakland is shot with the naturalistic visual grammar of the real. No Afrofuturist color palette, no architectural grandeur. Kids playing basketball on a court that needs repaving, buildings that need maintenance. The horizon is flat and urban and not beautiful in the way Wakanda is beautiful. This visual contrast is doing precise work. It is showing you, without narration, what Wakanda's choices have allowed to persist. The grandeur of one and the deprivation of the other are not unrelated aesthetic choices. They are connected through the specific history the film has laid out, through T'Chaka's choice, through centuries of Wakandan silence. The production design is, in this sense, the film's most honest political statement. Here is what Wakanda looks like, and here is what Wakanda's absence from Oakland looks like, and now you see the relationship. I want to be careful here, because talking about Chadwick Boseman's performance requires acknowledging that we are talking about a man who is no longer alive, whose absence from the world is a specific kind of grief for those who understood what he was. He was magnificent in this role. He was magnificent in every role. What I'm about to say is not a critique of Boseman, but an observation about what his performance actually communicates, which is more complicated than what T'Challa's official arc would require. Boseman plays T'Challa with a quality of uncertainty that deepens through the film. This is often described as T'Challa growing into his power. But watch the specific texture of the uncertainty more carefully. It is not the uncertainty of inexperience. It is the uncertainty of a man who, at some level, knows the argument being made against his position is correct. When Killmonger speaks in the throne room, T'Challa doesn't argue back. He absorbs, he watches. There is something in Boseman's stillness in those scenes, not royal stillness, not deliberate stillness, but the stillness of someone who is listening to something they did not want to hear and cannot immediately refute. The scene in the ancestral plane where T'Challa confronts his father is the most telling. He says, "You were wrong. All of you were wrong to turn your backs on the rest of the world." T'Chaka doesn't deny it. He says, "I chose my people." And T'Challa's response, "You were a good man, but a bad king," is the closest the film comes to explicitly adjudicating the thesis. But notice what he says. He doesn't say T'Chaka was wrong to prioritize Wakanda's safety. He says T'Chaka was a bad king, meaning he failed his people. Which people? Wakandans, his own. The argument Killmonger was making about the 2 billion people whose suffering Wakanda enabled through its silence is not what T'Challa condemns his father for. He condemns him for the personal crime, abandoning Eric, creating Killmonger, setting up the succession crisis that almost destroyed Wakanda. He is still thinking, in that scene, about Wakanda's interests, not about the world's suffering. The film frames this as his moral awakening, But it is, if you listen carefully, still a fairly provincial moral awakening. He's not saying we should have been doing more for Black people globally. He's saying you made a personal mistake that endangered our kingdom. Boseman's performance registers this distinction even if the script doesn't fully honor it. There is, in his final confrontation with Killmonger, a quality that is not triumph. Killmonger says, "You are going to kill me? There is nothing for me to live for if I go back in chains." And T'Challa says, "Maybe we can still heal you." And the word maybe lands wrong. It lands like doubt. It lands like a man who knows he is winning a fight he shouldn't have had to fight, against an argument he is not fully answering, by means of physical force rather than moral persuasion. That maybe is the most honest word in the film. It is a king who is not sure his kingdom deserves to survive in its current form, trying to offer mercy to a man who is right about everything except the method of redress. There is one production design detail that I want to dwell on because it contains the film's entire argument in concentrated form. The heart-shaped herb, the plant that grants Wakandan kings their superhuman abilities, is burned by Killmonger shortly after he takes the throne. It is one of his most clearly destructive acts. It is presented as evidence of his willingness to destroy Wakandan heritage, to burn tradition, to be the scorched earth revolutionary who tears down without building. But think about what the heart-shaped herb actually is. It is a biological monopoly. It is a resource that grows only in Wakanda, that grants power only to those Wakanda chooses to give it to, that is controlled entirely by the Wakandan royal family. It is, in the film's visual and narrative grammar, the concentrated symbol of Wakanda's hoarding, a literal plant that makes kings powerful and is unavailable to anyone Wakanda decides shouldn't have it. When Killmonger burns it, he is not simply destroying heritage. He is destroying a mechanism of controlled power distribution, and his specific stated reason is to ensure that no one after him can use it to challenge his rule. This is the imperial logic critique coming true. He is using the destruction of privilege to consolidate his own. But there is another reading. When the herb is gone, Wakandan power ceases to be a birthright monopoly. It becomes, for the moment before the technology fills the gap, something else, a question. Who should have this power? How should it be distributed? What does it mean that one family controlled it for generations? The film doesn't pursue this reading. It mourns the herb's loss. It stages the burning as tragedy. But the burning raises a question the film would rather not answer. Was the monopoly the tragedy, or the burning of it? Let me put the thesis in its sharpest form, the form that I've been building towards since the first module, the form that the film itself earns through its own arguments, even as it tries to contain them. Black Panther is a film that makes the most rigorous argument for Black radical politics available in mainstream American cinema, and then kills the man making that argument, has its hero adopt a sanitized version of it, and asks us to celebrate the result. It is a film that tells the truth about what Wakanda represents: hoarded privilege, colonial complicity, the violence of chosen silence, and then resolves that truth with charity rather than justice. It is, at its most honest, a confession dressed as a triumph. And the confession is this: T'Challa's victory is not a moral victory. It is a structural preservation. It is a structural preservation. He wins because Killmonger makes a strategic error, not because T'Challa makes a better argument. He adopts Killmonger's conclusions while discarding Killmonger's urgency. He goes to the United Nations and announces Wakanda's opening, while the man who demanded that opening, who was correct to demand it, is buried, presumably, in the earth of a country that never claimed him while he lived. That is not a triumph. That is a parable about how power works, how it survives, how it accommodates just enough of the challenge against it to stabilize itself without fundamentally changing. There is something almost painful about the film's final image. If you watch it honestly, T'Challa lands in Oakland, in Killmonger's neighborhood. He stands outside what will become the first Wakandan International Outreach Center. Shuri is going to run it. There are children. The sky is that particular Oakland blue, warm, coastal, specific. It is genuinely moving. Boseman plays it with quiet dignity. The music swells. It is, aesthetically, a perfect ending. And it is, politically, an endpoint that Killmonger would have found insulting. Not because it is nothing, it is something. An outreach center in Oakland, staffed by Wakandan scientists and teachers, offering the community's children access to the most advanced education and technology in the world, is a real and meaningful thing. It is better than the nothing Wakanda offered for centuries. But let's be precise about what it is and what it isn't. It is a gift. It is charity extended by a king to a community at his discretion. It is not reparation. It is not structural. It is not the mobilization of Wakandan power in service of the global Black community's self-determination. It is a building in one neighborhood, in one city, in one country, offered as the resolution of a crisis that spans continents and centuries. Killmonger said, 2 billion people all over the world look like us. T'Challa's answer is, here is a building in Oakland. The gap between the demand and the response is the film's real politics, and the fact that the film presents the building as a satisfying conclusion, as the thing we should leave the theater feeling good about, is the film's most revealing choice. It is calibrating our expectations downward from the demand of justice to the gift of charity, and it is doing so with such warmth, such beauty, such emotional generosity, that the recalibration feels like growth rather than retreat. Bury me in the ocean with my ancestors who jumped from ships rather than live in bondage. This line, this single line. It is the most politically incandescent sentence in any Marvel Studios film, and it arrives in the context of a man choosing death over subjugation, over the specific subjugation of being imprisoned by the country that abandoned him, by the king who defeated him in a battle whose outcome determined whether his argument would be heard. The choice is explicitly coded as the choice of the Middle Passage, the enslaved Africans who threw themselves overboard rather than accept the chains. Killmonger is comparing his potential imprisonment by Wakanda to the experience of the enslaved. He is saying, I will not be captured again, not by this country, not by this king, not by the system that has been offering me chains and calling them mercy since 1992. And then he dies. Looking at a sunset, his request for burial, the ocean, is never addressed in the film, which is an oversight that functions as metaphor. His last wish for connection to the ancestors of the Middle Passage, for burial in the water that swallowed them, is left unanswered. He dies, making a demand that is immediately forgotten in the film's rush toward its hopeful ending. This is what Killmonger's death cost the film. It removes the argument's most urgent, most historically grounded, most emotionally present advocate. And by removing him, it allows T'Challa to adopt his argument in a form that has been stripped of its urgency. You can advocate for Killmonger's conclusions after Killmonger is dead. You just have to be gentle about it, measured, institutional, king-like. The death is not a narrative accident. The film needs Killmonger to die because the film needs his argument to be adoptable without being threatening. Dead radicals are useful. Living radicals are dangerous. T'Challa cannot be the enlightened king who opens Wakanda while Killmonger is still alive to say, that's not enough, that's not fast enough, that's not what I was asking for. So Killmonger dies, and T'Challa inherits his vision in a form that Killmonger himself would not recognize as his. This is also, it should be noted, a historical pattern. The radical who makes the argument is destroyed. The moderate who comes after adopts a portion of that argument in safer form and is celebrated. Malcolm is killed and Martin is canonized. Fred Hampton is murdered and the diversity initiative is funded. The man who demanded transformation is removed, and the man who offers accommodation is given the Nobel Prize. Black Panther is dramatizing this pattern. It may not be doing so intentionally, but but it is doing so with precision. Here is the hardest thing to say about T'Challa, the thing that the film's warmth toward him makes difficult but necessary. His greatest failure is not tactical or moral, it is imaginative. At every point in this film where he is confronted with the argument for Wakandan engagement by Nakia, by Killmonger, finally by his father's ghost, T'Challa's response is to frame the question as one of control. How can Wakanda engage while maintaining control of its resources? How can it help without being exploited? How can it open without being invaded? These are legitimate questions, but they are the questions of a man who cannot imagine a world in which Wakandan power is not fundamentally a Wakandan possession, in which the global Black community might have some claim to it, some stake in how it is used, some voice in the decisions that affect their lives. The UN speech is the clearest expression of this failure. T'Challa goes to the United Nations and offers Wakanda's assistance to the world. He frames it as an offer, a decision he has made, a gift he is extending. He does not go to the UN and say, Wakanda has failed in its obligations, here is our plan for reparation. He goes and says, Wakanda is ready to share, on our terms, at our discretion, through institutions we participate in. There is no consultation with the communities most affected by Wakanda's centuries of silence. There is no mechanism for the Black diaspora to have a voice in how Wakandan resources are deployed. There is no acknowledgement that the decision about how Wakanda engages with the world should involve the people most harmed by its non-engagement. There is a king making an announcement to a global institution on behalf of people who were never asked. This is the liberal failure mode in its most clarified form, the belief that the benevolence of the powerful is an adequate substitute for the agency of the powerless. T'Challa is not malicious. He is not even, by the film's end, particularly conservative. He has moved, genuinely moved, from isolation to engagement. But he has moved within a framework that keeps power where it was, in the hands of the king, to be dispensed according to the king's wisdom, at the king's pace, in the forms the king determines appropriate. Killmonger's most damning line is not the one about 2 billion people. It is quieter than that. When he first arrives in the throne room and the elders are uncomfortable, he says, "Hey, Auntie." 2 words. He is claiming kinship. He is saying, I belong here. I am not a petitioner. I am not a refugee. I am family, and family doesn't ask permission to come home. T'Challa never quite hears that line for what it is. He hears a challenge to his throne. He does not hear, or chooses not to hear, the argument underneath that the global Black community is Wakanda's family, and family doesn't need to wait for an invitation, and the outreach center, however lovely, is still an invitation extended rather than a homecoming acknowledged. I want to be precise about what I'm arguing here, because I am aware that this analysis can be, and often is, used as a weapon against a film that deserves far better than weaponization. The cultural achievement of Black Panther is real and is not what this essay is interrogating. The representation it offered of Black excellence, Black beauty, Black intellectual and creative achievement on the largest possible stage was meaningful and remains meaningful. The conversations it sparked, the community it built, the children who saw themselves in Wakanda and felt something they had never felt before in a movie theater. None of this is diminished by anything in this essay. What this essay is arguing is something different, that by celebrating the film in the way we celebrated it, as triumph, as representation victory, as the story of a righteous king defeating a dangerous radical, we miss the film's honest argument and, more importantly, we let ourselves off the hook. The celebration of Black Panther as T'Challa's story allowed us to identify with the king, not the man left in Oakland. It allowed us to feel the pride of Wakandan power without sitting with the question of what that power has been doing all this time. It allowed us to receive Killmonger's arguments as emotional texture, as the villain's compelling backstory, rather than as political claims that demand engagement. We got the pleasure of the radical argument without the discomfort of deciding whether we agree with it. That is exactly what the film was designed to do. And it is exactly what the film, at its most honest level, is critiquing. The audience's celebration of T'Challa is itself a demonstration of Killmonger's thesis. We prefer the story of the powerful man extending charity to the story of the dispossessed man demanding justice, because charity is comfortable and justice is demanding. Black Panther is a Killmonger film. Not in the sense that he is its hero. He is not, by design, by genre convention, by the structural demands of the MCU, but in the sense that his argument is the film's argument. His grief is the film's grief. His ghost haunts every frame of the hopeful ending. The Outreach Center in Oakland is Killmonger's monument, not T'Challa's achievement. It exists because a man from Oakland was correct about Wakanda's obligation, spent his entire short life trying to enforce that obligation, and died before he could see it partially, inadequately honored. T'Challa gets to stand in front of it and receive the warmth of the children's eyes. Killmonger gets the ocean. The film ends on hope. It earns the hope. The hope is real, the gesture is genuine, the children in Oakland deserve to look up at a Wakandan aircraft with wonder. But the hope is also insufficient, and the film knows it is insufficient, and the fact that it presents insufficiency as resolution is its most honest and most difficult confession. Ryan Coogler made a film about a man who was right and was killed for it, and then built a monument to him out of the very change he demanded and handed the credit for that monument to the man who killed him. That is not a superhero story. That is a history lesson. It is the history of every radical who has ever been right and every institution that has ever adopted the radical's conclusions after destroying the radical. Go back and watch it. Watch it for Killmonger this time. Watch the museum scene and stay with the correctness of his argument. Watch the throne room speeches and hear them as political philosophy rather than villain origin. Watch the ancestral plane and understand that his father's disappointment is not a repudiation of his diagnosis, but a grief about what the disease did to his son. Watch him die, choosing the ocean over chains, and understand that this is not a character moment, but a historical argument. The choice that enslaved people made at the Middle Passage, replayed in a fictional African kingdom, as testament to what you do to a people when you offer them nothing but the logic of their oppressors. And then watch the Outreach Center. Watch T'Challa standing in Oakland. Watch Shuri looking at the children. Feel the hope. Feel it fully, because the hope is real and earned and necessary. And then ask yourself, why did it take a dead man to get us here? How long had Nakia been asking? How long had the children of Oakland been waiting? What exactly was Wakanda protecting all those years, if not itself? And who gets the credit for the change? The film answers these questions. Just not out loud, not officially, not in the way that makes it onto the marketing materials or the Oscar citations or the celebratory think pieces. It answers them in the texture of the camera work, in the ache of the score, in the last words of the man who died looking at a Wakandan sunset and chose the deep water over the kingdom's mercy. Black Panther isn't a triumph, it's a confession, and the man it's confessing about, the man it owes its ending to, the man whose arguments it adopted and whose name it omitted, is buried in the ocean. T'Challa won the fight. Killmonger won the argument. We just haven't been willing to admit it. Rewatch the film, this time watch it for the man they left in Oakland.